Africa also criticizing the current government, saying that 14 individuals have already been arrested under Section 76 of the Electronic Communications Act 2008, among others. But the question also arises as to whether or not there is no responsibility on the side of individuals who speak, even under the various laws that protect freedom of speech. That's what we want to look at tonight. Hello, good evening, and welcome to Agenda. My name is Beatrice Sedu. Government do not abuse the rights of individuals. I am joined in the studio now by Professor Ali Seidu. He's a governance expert, also MP for Tamale Central. Good evening to you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Beatrice. It's always a pleasure.
I also do have with us lawyer Amanda Clinton. She is head of Chambers Clinton Consultancy. Good evening to you, ma'am. It's great to have you here again. Good evening.
Good evening. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm joined via video call as well, Mr. John Nkol, who is Country Director, Action Aid. If you can hear us, good evening to you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us. Okay, I can see you, but I cannot hear you. But thank you very much for joining us. Let me remind you that Agenda is brought to you by the Bank of Africa. Activate your dormant account with Bank of Africa. Enjoy our refreshed products and services, including our enhanced SME support, a facility, USD, a debit card, credit card, and more. You may also update your account at any Bank of Africa branch with your Ghana card, and kindly reach our call center on 0302 429333 or 0302 249690, or chat Fafa at www.boaghana.com for support or inquiries. Bank of Africa, as strong as a group, as close as a partner. I want to start with you, lawyer Amanda. Really, if you can tell us what your understanding is when we talk about freedom of speech and Ghana's current legislative instruments and anything that backs it.
Yes, well, thank you very much once again for having me on the show. It's great to be here. Freedom of speech is very much protected under the 1992 Constitution of Ghana. And, you know, since independence, we are one of the oldest democracies on the continent of Africa. We have very much enjoyed freedom of speech and the protection of that for human dignity, democratic participation, as well as accountability. And the Constitution, for instance, guarantees freedom of speech and expression, including freedom of the press and the media, as you well know. And Article 164, I think, makes it clear that freedom of speech also has to be relatively reasonable in terms of, you know, if it concerns national security, public order, public morality, public health, and protection of reputation, etc. It doesn't mean you've got this carte blanche of everything you say. Furthermore, you know, inciting violence, threats, hate speech, defamatory falsehoods, contempt is not legal in this country, as it isn't in most countries. But I do think the US and Canada in particular have advanced further than we have when it comes to something called SLAP principles, which is strategic lawsuits against public participation. And so because increasingly people were litigated against in order to prevent them from speaking, because this is another way of curtailing free speech. It is to make it hurt financially, make it hurt reputation-wise, etc. So the person is too exhausted in court. So everything from, you know, SLAP, defamation or reputation lawsuit, you can bring up a SLAP, that this is a SLAP principle, and it protects reputation, privacy, commercial interests, and confidential information. So because Ghana doesn't have, you know, hasn't regulated anything close to that, it means that litigants can, if they can't shut you up or they can't arrest you, they can just litigate you to death. and there isn't as much protection as one would ordinarily have.
When you talk about protection, you're talking about protection of victims?
Well, litigation is very costly, and legal proceedings can damage reputation. So, anybody from lawyers to journalists, etc. And this has been done several times. I think some of our award-winning journalists have faced several over the years, and they've either had to apologize publicly, whilst also having attached to that apology to pay millions of Ghana cedis, etc. And so nobody tends to speak against those people who have, over the years, litigated continuously. So freedom of speech is important, but I also think it's very important to appreciate freedom of speech. People can also weaponize against it, and they're increasingly doing more and more.
You said that's what we're seeing in Ghana?
I definitely think as a lawyer, we're seeing more and more of that in terms of litigation. We're seeing that in areas where we've never seen it before. For instance, debt recovery is something that's very standard, for most law firms, and it's very straightforward, particularly if money doesn't hit your account. But we're seeing a situation where increasingly even debt recovery lawyers are themselves sued, and then they have to get their lawyers, and then the person can get off that debt recovery before even the lawyer who wasn't party to the suit. And that's very peculiar, and it goes against public policy, because it means every single debt recovery lawyer in this country, because of this precedent that's been made this year, can be sued, and they would have to get their own lawyers. And so it's a way of ensuring that the person who owes the debt wraps the whole thing in sort of red litigation, you know what I mean? And so I think whilst we're discussing free speech, we can, of course, discuss the fact that people are thrown into jail, et cetera, but the weaponization of our courts in order to curtail free speech is at an unprecedented level, because it's going after people who are doing their job, and it can't be proven that money was given to them, but they're still being litigated. Do you see what I mean? So it's a very peculiar situation, I think, we found ourselves in 2026 under this new government.
I will come back to you on the weaponization of our courts, but you made a point about, before I come to you, Professor Ali Duseidu, you made a point about media houses supposedly, you didn't use that word though, being forced to apologize publicly. But we've seen instances where media houses have actually admitted that what they published was wrong, and therefore they were actually under obligation to apologize, as it were, and retract and apologize.
Well, no. I mean, I wouldn't say that per se in terms of when, because for instance, I was with Ghana this week and we happened to be looking at some key issues. And once we looked at some documentation, it seemed that another law firm had written a letter about a retraction, but that was based on falsehoods in terms of what was written in that legal letter. And so rather than the publication having to end up in court, etc., it's just easier for them that the viewers saw, that they saw that publication and they take it down in a few hours. But it's a very sort of cheap way to have a law firm write a letter, for instance. And another thing I found in terms of weaponization is that, I know some lawyers where, ahead of them appearing on a show, people who identify themselves as lawyers would call the show and say, oh, so-and-so person has a problem with this person, so maybe they shouldn't be on the show. And yet they didn't show any form of injunction or anything else, but you're damaging a person who's going to appear's reputation because you want to manage what they say. You see, so sometimes it ends up in slightly different territory, I think.
Let me come to you, Prof. Where do you stand? And we've just heard Lawyer Amanda Clinton talk about the fact that we seem to be weaponizing our courts. You monitored what's going on as well. Do you share the same view?
Well, I think free speech is a key component. In some textbooks, they even say it's the lifeblood of democracy. And the court is a state institution, largely in democratic institutions. Now, you cannot divorce the essence of democracy, free speech, from the essence of democracy. Largely, what free speech does in democratic governance process is to allow for healthy democratic debate, is to allow for participation, and to allow for accountability. And when you look at participation, accountability, reasoned debate in democratic system, these are the core tenets of good governance, which is tied to democracy as a system of government. So it is very important that free speech is guaranteed across the world. And it's not a recent endeavor. If you go back to the 5th century BC, in the city-state of Athens, there was a concept called frank speech that allowed people to freely express themselves within the public assembly. So you couldn't restrict what they say in as much as it doesn't offend the sensibilities of other people or it doesn't cause fear and panic within the public space. Then you travel back to the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, up to the first amendment of the US Constitution to the 1992 Constitution. So it has always been guaranteed because of its essence nature. And one of the ways that this can be guaranteed is also through the court system. Because when my reputation is attacked, either in the form of libel, whether it's written or spoken, definitely people seek redress within the court of competent jurisdiction. But the idea that rights enhances democratic freedom and democratic right to participate and guaranteed does not necessarily mean that it is absolute. Beatrice, it's not absolute because rights can be limited through a lot of legal entitlements. So one, human rights are subjected to limitation by the Constitution or through the Act of Parliament or largely through what? The court system. So this presents a serious democratic dilemma. To what extent in a democracy can we allow people to speak? To the extent that it doesn't take sex back to an authoritarian government rather than democratic government. So I think Amanda's issue about weaponizing the court being used to weaponize, do you say it's used to weaponize?
Yes, it says there's weaponization of courts increasingly. So
I think in a democratic system, the court is actually supposed to interpret the law and to guarantee the fundamental human rights of people where they are abused. But I also believe that where a court is attacked, the court has what? The power to be able to make sure that the people who attack it are justifiably.
So was it okay, for instance, for the court to detain Abronye when he insulted the judge and he was subsequently released?
So attacking a judge is not a good thing in a democracy. Technically speaking, you know that. Even if it's not a judge, even an ordinary human being, when you attack me and impugn my reputation, definitely I have the right. I have the right to seek redress. Do you understand? So I think it's not just even a court, but those kind of people are given that kind of special treatment. So definitely I think they have the right because they interpret the law, and attacking their personality and integrity undermines the kind of legislative processes and legal arbitration that they do. So I think using the court system to address these grievances is one of the best means that we can have things addressed in a democracy.
Let me ask you this before I go to Mr. Nko for his preliminary thought. You talked about responsibility on the part of individuals as well. Based on your own understanding, where do you place the limit as regards where free speech should end and where the government should also act because it feels people are abusing their freedom of speech?
So I think whenever you're going to say something, you should be mindful whether you are going to attack an individual's reputation. It's something people have built over time, and that is what makes people. If that speech is going to attack somebody's reputation, you have to be very careful. You also have to be mindful whether what you are going to say is going to endanger public safety. Definitely, if you have the right to freedom of speech, but you cannot go into a cinema and start shouting fire, fire, and then it will cause stampede and people will die. Definitely, at that particular point in time, your rights ends. If you have a freedom of speech, you should be mindful of the rights of other people who live in the society that you live. So you shouldn't just think that because you have the freedom of speech, you can say anything that has the rights of other people, that has the integrity of other people, or you can attack personality, or you can even call that somebody should be killed. I think the exercise of is a reasonable, rationalized kind of limitation, which is a serious dilemma in every democracy. The idea of protecting the rights of what? Freedom of speech, but also protecting public safety, but also protecting the integrity of responsible citizens who live in a state. So I think it's a delicate balance. But even we as citizens should know better that what you are going to say may have this kind of repercussion on the individual or on the state or on state institutions. So I think it's something that can easily, theoretically, be distinguished, but practically it's very difficult to be able to do.
It's very difficult to be able to do, you say. Mr. John Inko, I hope you can hear us now. Thank you very much for joining us. I can hear...
Thank you very much, Beatrice. It's always a great pleasure.
All right, that's great.
Hello, can
yes,
you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you so much for joining us. We couldn't hear you earlier. But let me ask you this. The current conversation seems to tilt towards the fact that the current government is stifling freedom of speech. With ActionAid, what would you say, where do you stand, really, on whether or not freedom of speech is under attack currently?
Yeah, thank you very much, Beatrice. And let me say good evening to your cherished listeners. It's always a great pleasure to be engaging in the media and, for that matter, enlightening our discussions around subject matter like this. You know, ActionAid is a human rights-based organization where we prioritize women's rights. We talk about gender justice. We look at climate justice and economic justice as the cornerstones for our economic development. On the subject matter under discussion, I agree with my colleagues that freedom of speech is a fundamental pillar in democracy, and I do not want to belabor that point. For us in the civil society domain, we recognize that freedom of speech empowers citizens to question their leaders, to demand accountability, and to ensure that the marginalized people whose rights are in most cases trampled upon, discover their voice, and by that they are able to question and live a life of dignity. This, however, requires responsibility. And so, in the domain that we work, we, for example, are looking at how journalists are free to question power, because at ActionAid, we realize that power dynamics, has influence over how government behaves. It has influence through what we call the hidden power and overt power. And for that matter, in some cases, like Amanda said, government sometimes oversteps its boundaries or maybe is high-handed. And it is in that respect that civil society organizations are calling for a balancing act in order to ensure that as long as citizens, journalists, activists, civil society organizations have the right to speak, they must be doing so within the confines of the law and ensuring that it is also within their democratic right, but also within the regime of morality, so you do not impugn the reputation of people in a way that it becomes almost irreparable. And therefore, from where we sit, the rights of activists, for example, talking about people in the Galamsey areas, they are youth leaders who come up to speak against the hazardous effects and the combined, economic consequences and, if you like, health consequences of our people. And so to stifle such people and deny them from representing their people, speaking up against, abuse and the exploitative tendencies of mining, we frown against that in civil society confines. And therefore, we call on government to continue to promote free expression in order not to weaken people's democratic right to speak. And I look forward to how we can further engage in these discussions and call for a balancing act. You may recall that, the institution that is responsible for peace came out with a communique calling on all sides to be very, very, very mindful of the fact that rights have limits, and therefore it is going to promote a lot of dialogue and ensure that the tension or the seeming tensions, that is occasioned by issues around people like Abroye, is curtailed. We call for all sides to maintain their decorum and ensure that journalists are practicing their journalism within the confines of the law. Citizens are demanding their accountability within the confines of the law. Citizens are not fearful, and government is not also high-handed and creating opportunities for people to refer to the use of the courts for weaponization.
Earlier, when lawyer Amanda Clinton was talking, she talked about the weaponization of our court. We've heard the Media Foundation for West Africa criticizing the government and indeed describing what's going on as discriminatory and excessive use of Ghana's false news laws, and he went on to quote other legislative instruments we have: Electronic Communications Act, Criminal Offences Act, among others. We've also heard investigative journalist Manasseh Azuri talk about this. In fact, he wrote on his Facebook page saying that he wasn't, using his words, he was ashamed of the president that he defended under the previous administration. Do you think that Manasseh, for instance, and the Media Foundation for West Africa perhaps are blowing things beyond proportion, or really, based on the work you do as well and your own monitoring, really they are within what is currently happening? That is the reality.
Yeah, from where we sit as civil society organizations, we look at the issues more generally as compared to people who want to limit to the current occurrences. ActionAid and other civil society organizations have raised critical concerns around the declining civic space. In other words, if you look at opportunities for citizens to speak up, our statistics, our research demonstrates that there is declining civic space for people to engage, to call for accountability, and so on and so forth. That does not start within only this government, but the research, over the last couple of years, over the last about 3 decades ago, we have looked at it, and more opportunities for people to speak up against especially societal ills, against civic actions, like I spoke about Galamsey and the rest, expanding plantations, that is clearing communities, very vulnerable communities from their arable lands, that opportunities are declining. And so generally, we look at it from that angle. And therefore, there's the need, coming home to the subject matter this evening, it is about the application of the law. And that is why, depending from where you sit, you may have different accounts. But what we are looking at is to have a middle ground where government is exercising restraint and working within the law, not weaponizing laws that we have in our statutory books, like, for example, the criminal code. For example, we talk about section 208. We also talk about Article 164. And all these are meant to regulate the application of the law to ensure that people do not impugn or override or overstretch their rights to speak, but to maintain, stay within the law. But in doing so, journalists, activists have to be mindful of the law so that we operate within the law. And where government is also exercising its rights to apply the law, there has to be opportunity for government to do so. It is only where, in each case, we overstretch and we overstep, then there is a right for concern. But as you look at the laws now, people who infringe upon the laws are granted bail within the law. And to that extent, while the law is being applied, we need to be careful in talking about weaponization, but to rather call for moderation and ensuring that government applies the laws within, a human faith. And I think that is where we as citizens or civil society organizations will seek to be calling for, sobering of minds and ensure that, the Ghana Peace Council gets involved with well-meaning citizens of this country. The traditional authorities need to speak up to be able to ensure that the tensions or the simmering tensions are regulated and brought up to a reasonable level.
So let me ask you this. How do you deal with a situation where, for instance, I saw a video of a young lady calling for someone to go kill the president? Of course, eventually she was arrested by the Ghana Police Service. We saw a picture of that. How do we handle that without putting it under the category that because the government is supposedly being high-handed, we are raising tension in the country?
Yeah, in the matter of the young lady, I believe that if you look at the context, I've been following the debate, the discussions throughout the week. We have evidence that the young lady was arrested. She was put before a court of competent jurisdiction. And I think a bail, has been granted of some sort. And to that extent, we need to be careful. And that is why I am calling on the well-meaning Ghanaians, citizens, journalists, those of us in the media, to manage this simmering tension by being cautious with our utterances and then engaging government to ensure that the application of the law is very well practiced and implemented. Otherwise, the peaceful democracy that we have, mind you, Ghana is being touted as one of the rising democracies in Africa. And one of the characteristics is that there's freedom of speech. Even though our studies have indicated that civic space is shrinking, but of course, technically, the democracy is allowing a lot more people to speak, and that is what allowed the young lady to speak. But the young lady must be speaking within the confines of the law, because if you threaten to harm anybody, I believe that you may be overstretching your freedom of speech, and you may be coming in direct confrontation of the law. That is why we must maintain a bridging effect. We must serve as, vanguards of the peace and security that we are enjoying in Ghana in order to ensure that we do not overreach, we do not jeopardize the peace that we have, because jeopardy of peace, as we can see around us, creates social tensions. And for us as development actors, women, children, and the youth become the worst affected under very tumultuous situations such as war. And therefore, please, political parties, the media, the journalists, we need to maintain separate minds. I like it when we fact check. There's one of your young lawyers in TV3 that I like so much in the case that when there are legal issues, he fact checks the issues, and such actions have to be encouraged. Joy also have a fact checking instrument, and I think that the media agencies should also serve as a regulatory mechanism within themselves to ensure that a few journalists that might be overstretching their rights, are called upon, and then we are maintaining the social equilibrium that we are currently enjoying.
Yeah, I'm coming back to you, Lawyer Clinton. The moral argument, once again, is why do we always politicize such issues and drag the executives in when the police is doing its work, when the judiciary is also doing its work?
Well, I think there's a fine balance. There's always going to be a fine balance, because Article 164, for instance, does curtail free speech in terms of, if it's national security, public order, and the likes, then you can't just infringe on, things that are going to affect national security and are going to affect public order, etc. If you're going to incite, for instance, violence, threats, hate speech, defamatory falsehoods, these are things that are already in the law. Unfortunately, Ghana doesn't have what is called SLAP legislation, and SLAP legislation is in the I think it's in the US and Canada.
US, you talked about it earlier.
Yes, strategic lawsuits against public participation. And literally, someone with financial means could wrap not only institutions, but lawyers, journalists, and a whole umbrella of particular CSOs in red tape in terms of back and forth, going to court, etc. Ghanaian courts do have a process, even though we don't have SLAP. We've got a way of judges, for instance, throwing out frivolous claims, vexatious litigation, abuse of process. It has no reasonable cause of action. But what we're increasingly seeing is that a frivolous claim is something that can easily be determined by, for instance, somebody's defense or just one document. But what we're increasingly seeing is judges are not prioritizing motions that would dismiss a frivolous claim, but would rather go ahead with litigation that supports the person. And then it means innocent parties are tied into litigation that they shouldn't be, so they'll spend more time paying for lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. And the only way to cure things like this is if our CSOs come together, like I think 14 of them came together in relation to,
illegal mining.
not just illegal mining, but the special prosecutor, 14 CSOs signed at the Supreme Court or wanted to be added. So these are the sort of organizations that should come together for SLAP legislation, which would mean there is codified law about early dismissal, cost sanctions that go against, people who have a lot of money to litigate, as well as legislative protection and to expedite such hearings because, again, some humble journalist with a brilliant mind would have to find a lawyer to wade through lots of motions and to categorize it, etc., so that it is better presented for the judge. That's more money, more time, and the better the lawyer, the more expensive it is. You know what I mean? And I do think that although the NDC won with an overwhelming majority, and they are the People's Party, and they are here because of that overwhelming majority. I also think as a party, particularly when you're just starting for a year, in terms of you've just come into power for a year and a half, if a lot of people, including CSOs, lawyers, and society, and journalists, are saying there seems to be an unusual temperature when it comes to how much free speech there is in this country. It is something that they have to look at and address and perhaps be a bit more tolerant about, because this is a party which had such free speech at the time. They could even say someone has 2 bathrooms and that's far too much, and they were allowed to say that, and they were allowed to even build an entire umbrella organization based on such ideals that why should people have 2 bathrooms? And they would explore these ideas, and then they became the mainstream. You see what I mean? And so in becoming the mainstream as well, like I brought up the last time on the show about Animal Farm, one cannot, be known as a party who is intolerant to a certain extent, but if it is the government and the police going out after people who incite violence, who are threatening, hate speech, defamatory falsehoods, contempt, and, infringe on national security and public, disorder, then that should certainly be, people should go against that. But not when it's weaponizing our courts, when it's making it expensive, when after the court finishes with that person, they would either have to retract publicly and or pay significant amounts only because they were wrapped up in red tape. Do you see what I mean?
When we come back, we'll talk about the responsibility of the media and really moving forward what needs to be done. Stay with us. And you're still here on Agenda on TV3. Tonight we're looking at democracy and free speech in Ghana. How do we balance people talking and also the government ensuring that people do not incite violence and there is peace in the country? A number of you have sent in your messages to us. Prince Nanaya Oyok just says, good evening, Beatrice. Alfred Awe says, anyone who came out and insulted any head of state should be held responsible because we are in a democracy. And Wahab Anas says, good evening, Prof. I believe that's to you, Professor Ali Seidu. And Ametapla Gideon Tete says, good evening, good work. The Abdul Hafiz Rufai says, great submission from our boss, Mr. Nkol. There is Kamaldeen Imoro says, beautiful submission from Mr. Nkol. Kelly Prosper says, proud to watch Professor Seidu Alidu speak with wisdom, composure, and remarkable clarity. His thoughtful analysis and deep understanding continue to motivate and inspire many young ones. Tamale Central remains grateful for his dedication and hard work. And there's also Alhaji Haruna Shaiman says, Beatrice, Ghana is the only country we have. Therefore, any citizen who falls foul of the law should be dealt with, but nobody is above the law. The MPP and NDC should get this right. And Adam Hussein says, we are proud of you, Professor Seidu. And a number of you are still sending in your messages and we'll read as many as possible. Let me remind you once again that Agenda is brought to you by the Bank of Africa. Bank of Africa, as strong as a group, as close as a partner. Before we went on that break, Prof, the main argument really was why we tend to politicize these things when we have law enforcement agencies that are supposed to be doing their work and to be ensuring that there's peace and unity in the country without anybody unnecessarily inciting violence through their speech.
Okay, Amanda, sorry, I said Amanda, Beatrice. I was saying behind the scenes that I think the political awareness and consciousness of Ghanaians has been increasing over time. And when you look at the issue of political engagement, people phone into radio, TV programs, people sending texts into radio, TV programs, people sit on TV and do analysis. And even the advent of social media has allowed people to create content in their bedrooms and then share it out there. So largely because we are political aware and also want to create an advantage for our political parties, people tend to say things that gives them political mileage, sometimes without even due consideration to the impact of what they have said. And you tend to see that most of the people who have actually breached the whole concept of either inciting violence or breach public peace are usually our politicians. And when they are arrested, the first thing they do, so if the law enforcement agencies are doing the work, the first thing they will do is to mobilize. They put it on their pages, oh, this particular person has been arrested, our director of communication has been arrested, and they will mobilize and come to either the BNR office or the police station or wherever they are to demand that that person is released. I heard an audio this morning, I can't verify the authenticity. Somebody saying that if another MPP person is arrested, they're going to burn down the headquarters of the NDC. So
Benjamin Jawu-Appiah, a member of the MPP, is said to have said that.
So if you say this and you don't want the police or law enforcement agencies to arrest you and then let you explain the circumstances and then the motive for saying that, then what kind of country do we want to create for ourselves? So I think moving forward, political parties should realize that your freedom of speech that is guaranteed by the Constitution also comes with a lot of responsibilities. And we also have to be very careful what we say. We shouldn't want to become heroes overnight by actually endangering our public peace and the collective welfare and the well-being of Ghanaians.
You talk about political parties should ensure. Do I get you, or do I understand it to mean that you think political parties are instigating and fueling the kind of atmosphere that we're having now?
I think mostly the people who breach our public peace and create this inconvenience for us are usually, I was going to say politicians, I'm not sure what
You're one of them. Well, you're a member of parliament on the ticket of a political party.
I think usually they say those things and they incite their supporters to say those things so that they feel like they are putting the government under pressure or they are actually criticizing government. It is part of the democratic right to criticize, but you criticize in a manner that doesn't bring public peace. You criticize in a manner that doesn't incite violence. So when somebody say this, and then the police arrest you, then you begin to call people to come out and defend your ability. I don't think it helps our democracy that much. Largely, I think political party actors, especially leadership within political parties, have a responsibility to let their people know that you cannot just go and sit down anywhere and say anything that breaches the public peace, and then they allow you to walk free. So I think the onus lies on political parties as democratic institutions and agencies to let their people know. The civil society can play an active role, as our senior colleague has mentioned. And the media is actually doing a lot by bringing these issues to the attention of the general public and then following it to its logical conclusion and letting people know what is happening in this country. So I think we individuals who are citizens of this country also have a responsibility to make sure that the right things are said at the right time, devoid of biases and devoid of what? Inciting hatred and what, how am I going to say, inciting hatred and also endangering public peace.
Some people say it's a double-edged sword, where we have the media sometimes even playing some of these insightful videos or audios just because they want the following and want people to respond to it in that way. You also did mention social media. To what extent do you think these have contributed to where we are and really the kind of responsibility that you want all to take?
So I think it's more about interest. And if you're doing a lot of interest, power interest analysis or dynamics, you tend to see that individuals or political parties or institutions that push their supporters to say these things have an interest. Because sometimes if these are some of the issues, arrest, always coming up, it gives them the opportunity to attack government. Or maybe if it is police that arrest people or beat people up when they are demonstrating, it gives them the opportunity to attack state institutions. And definitely if media houses are also playing this repeatedly, I think whether they are doing it to get a lot of viewers or they are doing it to make sure that people become aware of what is happening and participate in the public discourse, it's all based on interest. But I do think that the interest of the state should reign supreme to the interest of an individual, to the interest of institutions, so that we make sure that we create conducive atmosphere for good governance to occur and for government to be able to implement its policies and better the lives of the people.
Let me ask your thoughts really on moving forward, because you kept referring to, is the Article 164, really? And then we come to Article 21, which also spells out really the freedoms of individuals in this country. How do we balance this moving forward?
We balance it with common sense in terms of if you're going to be inciting for people to go and burn down a building or murder a head of state, etc., there is no grey area. That is something that should go before the court, and the court should deal with such a person. And I think we do have to be quite sensitive towards the polarization of politics, as Honourable just said, in terms of, you know, sometimes with politics, it's like a pendulum where people are so fixated on red or blue and, you know, so you're either this or you're that. And it's like a fever. You're trying to get a certain temperature to have mass reaction and mass feelings towards that. And, you know, it can be quite sad because, as I've often found after we close from TV stations, etc., the NDC and the NPP actually get on very well, you know, off camera. You know, that's the irony, you know. So I've always found that they get on incredibly well. And as soon as the camera's on, as soon as the, you know, radio is on, they just, apart from Honourable sitting here, who I've literally said to him whilst we were, you know, on break, he's the most measured of all the politicians I've met, in terms of usually they're very polarized just because they're on TV. And he's just, you know...
Well, he's coming from an academic background, so perhaps...
Well, maybe that's why. But the polarization is not helpful because you're trying to create a fever and then a reaction. Whereas behind closed doors, you get on, you eat together, you dine together, etc. So I do think, you know, civil education is very important. Institutional transparency is also important. So is responsible leadership, ethical media practice, fair enforcement of laws, judicial independence, and constitutional fidelity, you know, because our defamation laws could be stronger, our cybercrime laws could be stronger, public order laws as well, that could be worked on. But ultimately, I think we can approach this with a common sense approach in terms of if you incite someone to burn down a building, if you incite someone to kill a head of state or even any member of parliament, you know, and if you're doing these things, that is not conduct that is becoming of any citizen. Personal attacks, you know, inflammatory rhetoric, normalizing insults should not be something that is accepted. But then saying that, NDC, I think, behind closed doors would also have to think quite hard about the fact that they are supposedly the party of the people. And so if you are defined as the party of the people, and people identify you as the party of the common man, the average man, that average man might not always be able to express themselves. So maybe we need to educate them in terms of sensitization, etc. But to all of a sudden be deemed by CSOs and leading media personalities as being worse than the NPP is something that has to be discussed behind closed doors. And how can you address, free speech whilst also ensuring that it doesn't, disrupt public order?
Prince Nana Yaoyok says, good evening, Beatrice and your panelists. I appreciate all the submissions shared this evening. While we fully recognize the importance of free speech, I wonder whether sufficient consideration has been given to the context of the speech and the people affected by it. Especially or specifically, misinformation is not free speech. Calling for or inciting violence that creates insecurity is wrong. In my opinion, we should create proper avenues and programs to educate citizens on how to make responsible statements. Political parties in particular have a duty to guide their members on how they post and communicate online to avoid misleading or harmful content. We could criticize based on facts available. I'm coming back to you, Mr. Nko, for your final thoughts on really moving forward, what we should do to ensure that there is not an unnecessary agenda against a government. And again, we're also not overlooking how the government could be handling the issues of people's comments and under free speech, really.
Beatrice, this is also another very thoughtful question. And first and foremost, let me emphasize that free speech is not incitement of violence. Free speech is not also hate speech. Free speech is not gender abuse. In fact, because of time scarcity, if not, I wanted to bring the dimension of gender-based violence as part of the free speech discussion, but we can do that next time. Free speech is not ethnic or religious incitement. Free speech is not deliberate misinformation that threatens public safety. I think this has already been articulated. Further to that, free speech is not digital harassment and intimidation. And therefore, if you put all our discussion in context, the question that you ask is very relevant. First and foremost, how can we address these going forward? First, I emphasize civic engagement. Civic engagement. Civic engagement. Because if you look at the political tensions between the two dominant political parties, we need arbitrators. We need conciliators that will lead this discussion around creating an environment for free speech, devoid of mistrust, devoid of rancor. And one of those agencies, are there emphasized, is the Ghana Peace Council. The Ghana Peace Council needs resources. It needs capacity building to be able to engage these two political actors that I think are very, very important. You know, there is no group or entity that would totally frown on the action of a trusted arbitrator.
If you could be,
and I think that in this case, yes, in this case, we need to look at that. Then also, political parties must rain down on their political activists. So, for example, young people, this is my advice for young people, do not think that insults, intimidation of political opponents will create opportunities for you in future. I can assure you that when it comes to the selection for people for political power, that is where people will use your insults, to deny you of some of the political positions that you are, erroneously thinking that going on the attack spree will give you opportunity. And finally, social media. Social media. We need to have strong social media monitoring. The Media Foundation for West Africa has a critical role. Civil society organizations have a critical role. Civic education has NCC has a critical role. And then we can jointly be seen addressing the whole issue of free expression. Thank you very much, Beatrice.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anko. Let me just read two more of your comments and I'll take your 30-second final word. Sabit Zakaria says, listening to my boss, Honorable Professor Seydou Alidu. Okay, I'm sorry. It just slipped there. But there's Camille Boabu says, good evening, Madam Host. I think our democracy needs to be effective in the country and we must have Prof and his colleagues inside. Okay. I'm sorry I'm not able to read the rest of that. 30 seconds, please, and I'll give you 30 seconds as well.
I think free speech is the lifeblood of democracy. We cannot have democracy without free speech. And that is the reason why free speech is guaranteed across the world. But free speech is not absolute. Definitely, it comes with a lot of responsibility. And we must be responsible citizens and to make sure that what we say or do move this country forward rather than backwards.
All right. Thank you very much. Please, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think, social media in particular has transformed democratic participation by just ordinary citizens to participate in national conversations. But I do also think accuracy is important as well as, avoiding sensationalism and outrage and just being viral for no reason. You know what I mean? So I definitely think a common sense approach to free speech should be the guiding barometer whilst people get more educated.
Thank you very much. So I just realized that the comment was actually saying that they need you more in the classrooms to educate people than being a politician. But thank you very much, Professor Ali Dusay, the governance expert and also MP for Tamale Central. Of course, we had with us as well lawyer Amanda Clinton, head of Chambers at Clinton Consultancy, and by video call with us, Mr. John Nkol, Country Director, Action Aid. My name is Beatrice Edu. Thank you very much for joining us on Agenda tonight and for sending in your comments. Do join us again next week. Have a good night.